Welcome to the first screencast for the class Getting Schooled. Screencasts are embedded throughout the course to introduce and summarize the key concepts of the class. You may take notes on your own printed slides and return to screencast at any point in the class to re-examine content and your quest for mastery. I encourage you to take notes of your reactions to new information and to create a system where you can quickly identify questions that arise for you during the slideshow. I flipped the classroom so that your first exposure to new content is on your own outside of the classroom. Our classroom time will be devoted to clarifying confusing concepts, digging deeper into controversial issues, and developing strategies for teaching based on the readings and the screencasts. Before you begin any screencast, I encourage you to first surface your ideas about what you already believe. At the end of the screencast, I'll ask you to reconsider your original thoughts and make a mental note of how your thinking has changed over time. By now, you should have completed the course Prior Knowledge Activity and the mock PDK Gallup poll of your thoughts about public schools in the United States. It's important that you do these activities for two reasons. The first of which is that it's good for me to know what you already know and think about the topics we'll address in the course before we get into the course. It helps me to build a better course based on your prior knowledge and gives me a better ability to calibrate the simplicity or the complexity of course topics, readings, and discussions. If you went through the prior knowledge activity and survey and you thought to yourself, I really only vaguely know the meaning of some of these terms, some of them I don't know at all, and some of them, from what I know, I feel pretty strongly about, but I need to know more to be more informed, then you're definitely in the right place. Also, doing these activities will help you meet the first three objectives of this section of the course. Here are the objectives. At the end of this section, students will be able to identify political and controversial aspects of public schooling in the United States. They will be able to articulate an initial position on these political issues. They'll be able to prioritize issues in terms of relevance to individual students' current and future endeavors, and determine whether public opinion supports the student's position or not. And this slideshow and the reading will give you some additional background information to help you meet the last two objectives of this section, to differentiate between education policy and education reform, and to identify turning points in American educational history and competing motivation fueling those reforms. Getting Schooled is really a course about what folks like me refer to broadly as education policy and school reform. In other words, the course is about the things that we do together, be it informally in small groups, at the building level, the community level, the state, or the national level, to help improve education in the United States. Think anything from the local PTG or PTA all the way up through the US DOE. Education policy refers to the principles, rules, and laws that govern education systems. For example, you might have heard of ideas like No Child Left Behind, now the Every Student Succeeds Act, Race to the Top, or Common Core state standards. If you're planning on going into teaching, you've likely heard of the terms teacher certification, licensing, or credentialing. Or you might have heard that school attendance is mandatory for all children until a certain age. What is calling for all of these educational interventions? Well, the answer is that these are all examples of education policy. Take a minute on your own to think. Can you think of an education policy? The key here is that there are typically rules and laws that govern education systems. Hit the pause button if you need a second to think, and we'll come back to your example in class. Now, the term education reform refers to the many efforts that people undertake to improve schools and education generally. You might have heard the term reform in the context of, for example, the Protestant Reformation. In the case of the Protestant Reformation, a set of beliefs and ideas spread throughout Europe that led to pronounced cultural and political change. So reform, then, is just a way of saying intentional changes made with the goal of improvement. The term education reform conveys the same hope for change, improvement, betterment, only rather than being a religious change, as was the case with the Protestant Reformation, education reformers seek to bring about educational change. Unlike education policy, reforms might not result in laws or rules. Sometimes they're more like social movements. Education reformers use many different tactics to bring about what they see as change for the better in our schools. As you might imagine, someone's great idea to improve schools might appear to another as a full-on terrible idea. Take, for example, the Education Reform Initiative in the 1800s that had school teachers virtually immobilizing restless children. The thinking went like this. Children can't sit still and learn. Here's an idea. Let's fuse their tables to their chairs so they literally can't move around in their desks. And let's bolt their chairs to the ground so that they can't move their desks around in the room. Boom, an education reform was born. Scratch that, not just a single reform, but actually about 150 patents were taken out in this time period for schoolhouse furniture design, all along the same principles. A pretty well-known advocate of children's natural tendency to learn through play called out the new scientific inventions, writing, "Obliging science goes farther still, perfecting benches in such a way as to permit to the greatest possible extent the immobility of the child, or, if you wish, to repress every movement of the child. It behooves us to think of what may happen to the spirit of a child who's condemned to grow in such conditions so artificial that his very bones may become deformed." Can you guess who might have said this? Some of you might have heard of the name Maria Montessori from the Montessori method. Though we have plenty of classrooms outfitted with this type of furniture, the new tendency in education is to let children in kindergarten through second grade learn through exploration. There's also circle time or rug time based on the knowledge that children learn from one another, or that learning is socially constructed. Regardless, we've got a lot of ideas churning in education reform circles to solve the age-old dilemma of how we can, or whether we should, ask our kiddos to just sit still, for crying out loud. In the following slides, I present a few more examples of education reform initiatives. As early as the late 1600s in colonial America, Massachusetts formed the first public school laws to create mandatory schooling within the colony, and later in the state. In other words, they felt so strongly about schooling that they were ready to force all of the children to go to school by law. Take a look at the image of the textbook on the right side. It could have been used in any Massachusetts classroom in the colonial era. What do you think this curriculum focused on? If you said the curriculum was written in an effort to delude Satan in the hearts and minds of children, you win the prize. This was accomplished by teaching children to read so they were able to read and fully appreciate the Bible. Mandatory schooling has expanded over the last several hundred years in the United States. So now, while there's not national mandatory schooling policy, each state typically lays out laws saying that children need to be in school through a set age. But it's not really so kids can read the Bible anymore. States have a host of other reasons to make sure kids stay in school. Take a second to think about why this would be the case. Whose purpose does this serve? Okay, let's talk about more examples of education reforms. By the late 1800s, we saw another reform in the form of the Common School movement. Increasing numbers of European immigrants came to American shores to build a new life. While the public school system was alive and well in many states like Massachusetts at this point, our nation saw a vastly increasing number of public schools aimed at creating greater solidarity and group identity in the United States. You can imagine with all those different nationalities and languages being spoken, it was difficult to do the work of the Industrial Revolution. Common schools were created to teach folks English and to develop and build a uniquely American identity. And look at all of these happy children alive with the excitement of learning in their chairs that are fused to their desks, which are bolted to the floor. But let us not cast stones in our glass house. Okay, moving on to other education reforms. In the late 1800s and through the mid-1900s, I'm talking early 1960s here, not like the Dark Ages, the national government ran Indian reform schools that tried to solve the problem of what was considered then the savage Indian. In these schools, they would cut off American Indian males' hair and dress them in the Anglo fashion of the day and try to civilize them by exposing them in the curriculum or in their schoolwork to civilized ideas and disallowing them to speak in their native language. This, by the way, is the same young man in the two images. A key idea here, though, is that this work was undertaken by progressive thinkers and education reformers of the time to try to improve education conditions and equity across our developing nation. In hindsight, of course, it's largely regarded as cultural repression of American Indians. Yet throughout America's history, probably the most important reform effort was the fight for equal access to quality education, which is still very much underway today. Because states controlled education for a long time, they could refuse to integrate the schools, claiming this was a state's right to do so, and the national government had no constitutional authority to intervene. And this led to a long history of separate and unequal education for children of color. The movement to equalize education access dates back to before America was actually called the United States, but had its most momentous victories in the mid-1900s through a series of lawsuits brought by individuals against state boards of education across the United States, culminating in one of the most cited Supreme Court decisions of the 20th century. Do you want to take a guess? Okay, if you said Brown versus Board of Education, you win. The full name of this court case was the Supreme Court decision Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. But when the Supreme Court decided that schools had to be desegregated in Kansas because of the lawsuit that Brown brought, it set a precedent for all states across the nation that schools could no longer be segregated by race and still be in compliance with the American Constitution. We will come back again to the Supreme Court decision in light of the many repercussions it's had and continues to have on schooling in the United States. Even if you don't have little children of your own, this picture has to pull on your heartstrings. I just love the look of determination and maybe a little bit of rage on this woman's face as she is escorting her child to school. And all of these adults directing their racist protests toward a child makes me wonder how these people could look at themselves in the mirror. Again, let us not throw stones. We have many of our own parallel and contemporary examples of these struggles. Okay, so there you have several examples of education reform efforts in the United States. And I'm going to ask you to do some independent mental work now, or what I'll refer to throughout the course as a pause to think moment. Yes, you're right, I can't see or verify that you're actually doing this, but I'll remind you that in any coursework you undertake, you get out of it what you put into it. So just take maybe 4 or 5 minutes, listen to the directions, and pause the audio so you can answer the questions. First, a little framing. You'll notice here that these different policies and reforms stem from very different motivations. In some cases, education reforms were a product of a desire to literally school American children. I want you to think, in this case, of a school of fish. How do we get our children to move in unison, to think the same or act the same, to move together? In other cases, education reform is enacted to try to educate Americans. Unlike schooling, other education reform efforts were carried out in order to liberate Americans by exposure to enlightened ideas. These are very different approaches, motivated by very different understandings of what education should be. So I want you to think on your own, is schooling a necessary evil, or should we be aiming to educate American children? Here are a series of related questions that I'd like to ask you. If you could pause the video on these 4 questions, you can answer them now. First, describe some of the commonalities you see across these different reform efforts. Think in terms of people's motivations for the movements. For each reform effort, consider whether the reform effort or policy change occurred at the local, the state, or the national level. Finally, and here's the juicy one, is the problem that this reform was brought about to solve actually solved now or not? Consider if it's worth solving and how you think schools might solve it. So this might be a good slide to print out, and be sure that you've got a firm grasp on all the different concepts embedded in each. This is sort of like a checklist. Do you have a strong sense of what each of these terms means? Okay, so there you have it, folks. We're now at the end of the screencast for Section 1, where we tried to answer the question, are schools political, and should they be? Let's go over the objectives once more and consider whether or not you're gaining greater clarity or even mastery of these objectives. At the end of this section, students will identify political and controversial aspects of public schooling in the United States, articulate an initial position on these political issues, prioritize issues in terms of relevance to individual students' current and future endeavors, determine whether popular opinion supports your position, and differentiate between education policy and education reform, and finally, identify turning points in American educational history and competing motivations fueling those reforms. So there you have it. I'll see you in class.